Here are 3 communication tips for men when confronted with information that you haven't heard before that might allow you to thrive better in relationships and that I wish I had known when I was younger. Before we get into it, let me just say this. I think a lot of men are socialized to be combative in relationship and in discussion as a means of trying to come to a resolution. It's not a very effective strategy, but it's one we learned from our fathers, we learned it from their fathers, and I won't get into all of it, but I think it's actually part of military culture. Because when you are in a life or death situation, it makes sense to play war games, to run through every single possible scenario to make sure that you are trying to minimize the damage as much as possible. But in a relationship, hopefully it doesn't feel anything like war. That dynamic surfaces when we are presented with new information or information that runs contrary to what we know to be true from our own experience or from our own socialization. And what ends up happening is we immediately push back and say, no, that can't be true, or no, that doesn't make sense, or no, prove it to me. And none of those things, as it turns out, allow your partner in the relationship to feel safe to continue the communication. But communication is a skill, meaning we can actually practice these things. So, number 1. Tell me more. When your partner's bringing something to you and you don't quite understand and you start to kind of feel that urge to rise up in you and push back, tell me more. Allow them to flush out the idea. You might start arguing with something before they even get a chance to tell you what they're thinking. And that leads me into number 2. We're totally allowed to say, let me sit with that for a minute. Or let me sit with that for a while. It doesn't even have to be a set amount of time. Let me sit with that. Being able to sit in discomfort is not only a huge communication skill, it is a primary relationship skill. It took me far too long to realize that sometimes my partner just needed to move through big feelings. And if I tried to stop those feelings because they were making me uncomfortable, it actually stunted her own growth and her own ability to move through it. But when we can let somebody have their feelings and move through them, oftentimes we're able to find a much better resolution. Somebody can be genuinely upset in a conversation, and that thing can have very little to do with how they feel about you globally as a person. It may just be passionate about this particular subject. We don't have to take it so personally. And number 3, help me understand. Hopefully this is coming off genuinely because you really do want to hear more of your partner's perspective. That makes sense in a relationship, right? Like you'd want to know where somebody's coming from. And so when you say, help me understand, that can be followed up by a very specific question about what they've said, asking more about their experience, because people aren't just arguing in facts. Sometimes we are bringing to the table our actual feelings or the things that have happened to us. And the context around that really matters. And if you come from a more privileged or more powerful kind of intersectional identity, it's quite often the case that somebody else's experience from somebody who does not inhabit the same privileges is going to be different. And that is uncomfortable, but doesn't make it any less true. In fact, it might actually be more true, because sometimes privilege has us looking through a very myopic paper towel hole, and all we can see is what we can see. And until we start to ask questions, the ideas behind tell me more, let me sit with that, and help me understand are all about changing our posture in conversation and in relationship. Not every conversation has to be a battle. Sometimes you can win the argument, but lose the person.